If there's one message most of us have heard throughout our lives, it's that we're supposed to build something that matters. Maybe that's a career, a business, a family, a team, or even a legacy that outlives us. If you're a leader, you've probably spent years building trust, developing people, creating influence, and leaving things better than you found them. But I wonder if we spent so much time focused on what we're building that we've forgotten to notice who all that building has quietly been shaping. You can spend years building a remarkable life while slowly becoming the person you believe that life requires. It doesn't happen all at once. It happens in those ordinary moments. The dependable version of you gets rewarded, so you become even more dependable. The version of you that carries everyone else's weight gets praised. So eventually that becomes the way you move through life. And before long, you're no longer choosing those responses, you're living from them. And that's where I think something really important begins to change. You see, the strengths that once served you quietly become the identity that's leading you. I think that's why so many people eventually arrive at a place they can't quite explain. From the outside, life looks good. The business is growing, the family is healthy, the responsibilities are being handled. Most people looking in would probably say everything seems to be working. Yet underneath all of that is a quiet sense that something isn't fully settled. I don't believe that's because you failed or because you've lost your way. I think it's because somewhere between the expectations you embraced and the responsibilities that you accepted, you slowly stopped asking whether the person making those everyday decisions was actually the truest expression of who you are. That's the danger of confusing what's familiar with what's true. Some patterns feel naturally simple because we have practiced them for so long. Familiarity can be a really powerful teacher, but it isn't always an honest one. Psychology has been pointing to this for decades. We don't just simply repeat behaviors. Eventually, those behaviors begin shaping the way we understand ourselves. Every ordinary choice is introducing you to someone. The question is whether it's introducing you to the person you've practiced or the person you've been remembering. Most of us have never thought to ask that question before. You see, we grow up surrounded by people who genuinely want what's best for us. Our parents teach us, teachers guide us, mentors share their experience. Leaders point us toward what they believe is wise. And all of those voices matter. In fact, many of them become gifts that we carry for the rest of our lives. But what very few of us ever learn is how to receive all of that wisdom without slowly losing the sound of our own voice beneath it. Maybe that's because from the very beginning, we have always been taught to recognize wisdom in other people long before we're ever taught how to recognize it within ourselves. We learn to trust experience, expertise, authority, and accomplishment. And those are all valuable teachers. But somewhere along the way, many of us quietly stopped believing that discernment can also grow from within us. We become very fluent in everyone else's voice before we ever learned the sound of our own. Over time, we become incredibly skilled at gathering opinions, reading the room, looking for approval, and trying to make the right decisions. We don't even realize that we've developed this habit of looking everywhere else before we pause long enough to notice what's already within us. Leadership isn't revealed by how much advice you collect. It's revealed by what you do once you've heard it, Borrowed certainty tells you what to think. Wisdom teaches you how to recognize what's true. How many beliefs have you spent years defending that you never actually chose? They were simply inherited, passed to us by people who cared, by cultures that we belonged to, by organizations that shaped us until they stopped feeling borrowed and started feeling true. They can sound remarkably similar, and they often come from people who genuinely love us and sincerely want what's best for us. The difference isn't the advice, it's the place you're receiving it from. I don't believe God created us to spend our lives borrowing someone else's definition of who we are. I believe He invited us to receive wisdom while remaining faithful to the person He's forming us into. The strongest leaders that I've known weren't the ones with the loudest opinions or the fewest questions. They were the ones who could listen with humility, learn with openness, and still recognize when something didn't belong to the person God had been faithfully forming within them. Because no one else gets to live from the inside of your life. No one else gets to become the person that God is forming inside of you. That is a journey, truly a journey only you can walk. And every ordinary choice makes one voice a little easier to hear tomorrow. And it's either the voice that you've practiced or the one God has been patiently forming beneath all of the noise of the rest of the world. I think one of the greatest misconceptions that we carry is believing that remembering who we are should somehow change our circumstances overnight. It's as though we believe clarity is supposed to erase complexity, but it doesn't. Tomorrow is still going to look like tomorrow. Right? The meeting is still on your calendar. The conversations that you've been avoiding, they still need to happen. The people you love will still need you, and the responsibilities that you've accepted don't suddenly disappear because you've experienced a moment of clarity. What changes is far less obvious. What changes is you. And once that begins to happen, something also quietly changes with it. You can walk into a moment that you've experienced 100 times before. And we all have those. I bet a ton of them come to mind right now. Right? You walk into these moments like 100 times, and only this time you realize that something feels different. It takes a minute to really put your finger on it because from the outside, nothing really looks like it changed. The shift happened somewhere no one can see. It happens on the inside. I think that's the first glimpse of harmony. It's the quiet realization that your life no longer feels like it's pulling you in opposite direction. For a long time, many of us have made decisions from the version of ourselves that learned how to survive. It learned how to protect, how to achieve, how to prove, and still keep moving. That version deserves compassion. It's carried us through seasons we never had an understanding that there was another way to live before. Eventually, a different question begins to surface, though. Will you trust the person that God is faithfully forming? And I don't think that we get that question answered in one defining moment. It gets answered on ordinary Tuesday afternoons, in conversations that no one else will ever remember, and in decisions that never make the highlight reel of our lives. And we all have plenty of those. Sometimes it's as simple as choosing honesty instead of protecting an image, or realizing that your worth no longer has to be negotiated every time that you make a decision. That's where freedom begins. It's not freedom from responsibility, but it is freedom from believing your responsibility has to determine your identity. You don't suddenly become fearless, but you start to notice that you're no longer spending so much energy trying to prove you belong. Suddenly, you have room to breathe. You have enough space to listen and enough steadiness to respond instead of simply reacting. And in that space, you begin recognizing something that had been there much longer than you realized. Your presence. That quiet confidence that comes from no longer negotiating with your own identity every time life asks something difficult of you. The more I sit with this, the more I wonder if this is what God has been doing all along. Not trying to make us into someone else. He's patiently, and I do mean patiently, forming us until the person making our everyday choices finally lives like the person he has always known us to be. Something that becomes visible when our lives are no longer divided against themselves. So, tomorrow morning will still look remarkably similar to today. I understand that. And your calendar may still really be full. And so the demands on your life will also be very real. But if you walk into that day tomorrow as someone who is no longer trying to earn an identity that you've already been given, you'll discover that the most significant thing that changed was never your circumstances. It was you. And if you've ever experienced one of those moments, you know exactly what happens next. There is this brief, almost startling awareness where you catch yourself halfway through an old response. The ones that are going to pop up right away. Maybe you were about to say yes, or you were about to stay quiet. You were about to explain yourself one more time, and then something interrupts the pattern. And it isn't loud. It doesn't demand your attention, but it asks you to just notice. And for the first time, you realize that you've been calling something like who I am, when all along it was simply who you'd learn to be. That's usually the moment when someone looks at me and says, oh my gosh, I have been doing that my entire life. Are you kidding me? And then you can almost see the memories connecting in real time. Conversations begin replaying in their mind. Relationships suddenly make more sense than they ever have. And decisions they never questioned before take on an entirely different meaning. What always felt automatic is no longer invisible. I think that's the beginning of the journey. Because now you're asking, if I can see the pattern, what am I going to go do with it? And I think that's the moment where this stops being an interesting conversation between us and starts becoming a really deeply personal one. You have to understand that seeing the pattern doesn't change it, but choosing differently does. And every ordinary choice that follows in this conversation will start doing far more than solving whatever happens to be in front of you that day. It's quietly strengthening the version of you that made it. Now, we don't usually think about leadership that way. Most imagine leadership is forged in those defining moments, but long before anyone ever trusts us with a defining moment, we've been quietly training that person who will walk into it. Listen, every decision leaves something behind. Every response reinforces the place it came from. The more often that you return to the same way of thinking or the same way of carrying the weight, the same way of proving yourself, the same way of protecting yourself, the more instinctive it becomes. I mean, after a while, it stops feeling like a decision and it starts feeling like your identity. And we have become remarkably proficient at whatever we practice, right? We understand this everywhere else in life, this idea of practice. Athletes practice, musicians practice, great communicators practice. And somehow we've forgotten that we also practice our ways of thinking, the ways of leading, and even our ways of being. And you know it's true in business, in leadership, in your life. So the question isn't whether you've been practicing, because we all have. The question is who you've become proficient at being. Do you see that? Have you become exceptionally good at carrying what was never yours? Likely the answer is yes. Have you become exceptionally good at reading every room before you ever listen to your own heart? At earning your worth one more accomplishment at a time? At protecting an image that God never asked you to maintain? Because proficiency has a way of disguising itself as truth. Success can disguise itself as alignment. Even responsibility can disguise itself as faithfulness. That's what makes this so deceptive. You can become incredibly effective at living from a version of yourself that God never intended to lead your life. And if that version of you has been strengthened through thousands of ordinary choices, then don't be surprised when that's the version your leadership keeps introducing to everyone else. You see, leadership is always reproducing the person who's leading, the version of you that you're putting out there. So people aren't simply learning from the decisions that we make. They're also learning from the place those decisions come from. They begin adopting what we normalize, what we tolerate, what we avoid, and what we quietly reward. That's how culture is formed. Long before strategy ever reaches an organization, leadership has already entered the room. Leadership eventually introduces everyone else to the person you've been becoming in private. The conversations that no one else heard, the compromises that no one else noticed, and the courage that no one else applauded quietly became the leader everyone else now experiences. Once that settles in, it's difficult to look at an ordinary choice the same way again. I know it has been for me. You begin realizing there really aren't as many insignificant moments as you once believed. What used to feel routine starts feeling formative. A conversation, a response, a quiet compromise, a courageous truth. They don't just pass through your day and disappear. Every one of them leaves its mark, quietly shaping the person who will show up in the next moment, the next relationship, the next opportunity to lead. Maybe we've misunderstood, or maybe we've underestimated the ordinary. We've spent so much of our lives preparing for defining moments without realizing those defining moments have quietly been preparing us. Long before the pressure arrives, something else has already been happening. We've been rehearsing. Yeah, rehearsing. Rehearsing what we'll believe under pressure, how we'll respond when we're misunderstood, and ultimately the kind of leader we'll become when the stakes are the highest. Now, pressure doesn't interrupt that rehearsal. It simply reveals what we've practiced often enough that it no longer requires our attention. It's so automatic. And I think that's why the first response isn't always the truest one. It may just be the quickest one. Boom, repetition, right? The one that's had the most repetitions, in fact. The one that's been strengthened by hundreds of ordinary choices that never seemed important enough to notice. I think that's one of the greatest deceptions we live under. We assume our strongest response must also be our truest one. Speed has a way of convincing us something is true simply because it arrived first. Sometimes it's simply our most familiar one. There's a difference. But our minds are remarkably efficient. And once a response has been practiced often enough, it begins arriving before we've even had the opportunity to ask whether it still reflects who we are. It just shows up. And that can be incredibly useful when we're learning a skill. But it is far more dangerous when what we've been practicing is an identity. I mean, after a while, we begin assuming the first response must also be the truest one. Sometimes it's just the most familiar one, and familiarity has a remarkable ability to disguise itself as identity. And although it disguises itself as identity, it doesn't stop there. Without ever realizing it, the pattern we've practiced long enough, it becomes, this is just who I am. This is me. And before long, it also becomes, this is just how I lead. How many times have you ever said that? Success only reinforces it too. What was once simply familiar, it also slowly becomes trusted, and trusted things rarely invite themselves back into question. That's where we quietly stop growing. You see, growth has a way of slowing the moment we become more committed to protecting what has worked than remaining curious about what's true. Sometimes life rewards that version of us so generously that we never stop to ask whether the very thing producing the results is also producing the person that we want to become. Not every successful pattern deserves a permanent place in your life. I think this is where faith begins changing from something that we talk about into something we actually live. It's not expressed through certainty, and it certainly isn't measured by having every answer, because who the heck has that? But it grows every time we're willing to trust that the deepest truth about who we are runs deeper than every expectation we've ever inherited, every role we've ever accepted, and every identity that we have practiced long enough to mistake it for our own. That kind of trust has a way of asking difficult things of us, one ordinary choice at a time. It quietly invites us to look at responses we've relied on for years and then ask whether they're still telling the truth. Some of those responses have carried us through seasons that demanded more than we thought we had. Some helped us build successful businesses, meaningful relationships, and lives that we're genuinely grateful for. And that's why this isn't about rejecting your past. It's about recognizing that not everything which kind of carried you or got you here is meant to keep leading you from here. Everything begins to shift the moment you're willing to ask a different question. Does this still belong? Maybe it's a way of thinking you've carried for years. Maybe it's the responsibility you've never questioned. Maybe it's the version of yourself you've protected because it once helped you survive. The question isn't asking you to erase your story. It's just asking you whether that story still deserves to write the next chapter. Listen, real courage may look quieter than we've ever been taught. Sometimes it looks like having the humility to stop calling everything that you've practiced you. Something begins to settle when the argument inside you finally goes pretty quiet. The circumstances may not look any different. The meeting still happens. The difficult conversation still finds its way back onto your calendar until you have it. Life doesn't suddenly become easier, although we wished it would. You see, what changes is the place you're living from. You're no longer bringing two different versions of yourself into every decision. The person making the choice and the person you've been becoming are finally moving in the same direction. Now, it's a bit difficult to explain until you've actually experienced it for yourself, which I hope you do. You see, from the outside, almost nothing appears different. The conversation sounds ordinary, the room looks the same, yet something has shifted that everyone else can feel. They can feel it, even if they can't quite explain it. I've come to believe that that's because leadership has never been communicated only through our words. Long before we offer direction, we're already communicating something about ourselves. People don't just respond to what we say, they respond to the place within us those words are coming from. I've watched that happen in boardrooms, in businesses, around kitchen tables, and in conversations that never make the headlines. The circumstances were never what changed. The shift always happened within the leader. At some point, they stopped leading from the version of themselves they had practiced and started living from the person they had finally learned to trust. Maybe that's why we've all met people who quietly changed the atmosphere of a room without ever trying to. You know those people. Before they've offered a solution, before they've shared an opinion, before they've tried to prove themselves, something already feels different being around them. It isn't charisma. It isn't personality. It's the quiet coherence of someone who is no longer divided within themselves. The more I watch leaders, the more convinced I become that we have underestimated how much our lives are always communicating. We leave fingerprints everywhere we go, in our homes, in our businesses, in our friendships, in every room that we enter. People may not remember every word we spoke, but they'll remember how it felt to be led by us. They'll remember whether our presence brought clarity or confusion, steadiness or anxiety, courage or hesitation. When faith has become trust and your fire has finished refining what no longer belongs, something begins to emerge that cannot be manufactured. There's a steadiness to it, a quiet confidence that isn't trying to impress anyone because it no longer needs permission to exist. Leadership begins carrying something strategy alone could never create. Presence stops competing with performance because there's finally nothing left inside that's divided against itself. Which brings me all the way back to where we started this first conversation today. Most of us spend our lives trying to build something that matters. A business, a family, a career, a legacy. And those are all really beautiful things to build. But while your hands have been building all of those beautiful things, your ordinary choices have quietly been building someone else. You. Every conversation, every decision. They've all been participating in that work. The question has never been whether you're becoming, because we are always becoming someone. The only question has ever really been, who are you becoming?
Leadership isn't what you perform, it's what you embody. If this conversation resonated, share it with someone ready to lead differently. And remember, when your faith ignites your fire amplifies your frequency. Until next time.